Hello and welcome to Nighttime Biographies. Imagine a woman who never owned a decent dress, yet won 2 Nobel Prizes in different scientific fields. Picture a Polish immigrant who could barely speak French when she arrived in Paris, yet became the first woman professor at the Sorbonne, an institution that had stood for 7 centuries without a single female professor. Consider a mother of 2 daughters who worked with substances so dangerous they would eventually kill her, whose laboratory notebooks are still too radioactive to handle safely more than a century later, yet who revolutionized our understanding of matter itself and saved countless lives through her discoveries. This is the story of Marie Curie, born Maria Sklodowska, in a country that did not exist on any map, who would become the most famous woman scientist who ever lived. She discovered 2 new elements. She coined the term radioactivity. She was the first person ever to win Nobel Prizes in 2 different sciences. She founded the discipline of radiochemistry. She drove ambulances equipped with portable X-ray machines through the battlefields of World War I, saving thousands of lives. She did all of this in an age when women were not permitted in most universities, when female scientists were considered curiosities at best and abominations at worst, when a woman's place was emphatically not in a laboratory. And she did it while raising 2 daughters largely alone, after her husband and scientific partner died tragically young. She did it while fighting poverty, prejudice and illness. She did it in a foreign country, working in a converted shed with a leaking roof and no ventilation, stirring massive vats of radioactive material with an iron rod as tall as herself. Before we begin this journey, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel. It is a simple and wonderful way to support this work, and it means a great deal to me. I am also always curious to know where in the world and at what time you're joining me tonight, so please leave a comment and tell me where you're watching from. And now, settle in. Let the noise of the modern world fade away. Let us travel back 1.5 centuries to a world of gas lamps and horse-drawn carriages, of rigid social hierarchies and scientific revolution, of an occupied nation where speaking your native language could get you punished, and a young girl who dreamed of studying at a real university when such a thing seemed impossible. Tonight we will follow Maria Sklodowska from the schoolroom in Russian-occupied Warsaw where her story began, through the bitter cold of a 6th-floor garret in the Latin Quarter of Paris, into a ramshackle shed on the Rue Le Monde, where she made discoveries that would change physics and chemistry forever, across the Atlantic to receive honours that had never been given to a woman, and finally into the sanatorium in the French Alps where her body, poisoned by years of radiation, exposure would give out at last. It is a story of genius and determination, of sacrifice and triumph, of a mind so brilliant and a will so fierce that no barrier could stop it. Marie Curie lived for 66 years, and in that time she accomplished more than most institutions. She proved that atoms were not indivisible. She showed that radioactivity was an atomic property. She isolated radium and polonium. She established the field of radiochemistry. She trained a generation of scientists. She brought X-rays to the battlefield and saved countless lives. How did she do it? How did a girl from occupied Poland, with no money, no laboratory, and no right to attend university in her own country, become the first woman to win a Nobel Prize, the first person to win 2 Nobel Prizes, and the only person ever to win Nobel Prizes in 2 different sciences? That is the question we will answer tonight. But before Marie Curie became a legend, she was simply Maria Sklodowska, the youngest, daughter of a teacher in Warsaw, born into a world determined to crush Polish dreams and Polish identity. Her story begins not in triumph, but in the shadow of Russian occupation, in a family that valued education above all else, even as the occupiers tried to stamp out that very hunger for knowledge. Warsaw in 1867 was a city caught between memory and erasure. The Russian Empire had absorbed much of Poland in the partitions of the late 18th century, carving up what had once been one of Europe's great kingdoms among Russia, Prussia and Austria. By the time Maria Sklodowska was born on November 7th of that year, Poland had ceased to exist as an independent nation for more than 70 years. Yet the Poles had not forgotten. They had rebelled repeatedly, desperately, futilely. The November Uprising of 1830, the Krakow Uprising of 1846, and most recently, most devastatingly, the January Uprising of 1863, just 4 years before Maria's birth. The January Uprising had begun with hope. Polish patriots, convinced that this time would be different, had taken up arms against the Russian occupiers. For months they fought, using guerrilla tactics, striking from forests and villages, keeping the dream of independence alive. But the Russian response was overwhelming and merciless. By 1864, the uprising was crushed. The leaders were executed or exiled to Siberia. And the Russian authorities, determined that there would never be another uprising, imposed a regime of cultural annihilation. It was called Russification, and it was systematic, deliberate, and ruthless. The Polish language was banned in schools, in government offices, in public spaces. Children were forced to learn in Russian, to recite Russian history, to sing hymns praising the Tsar. Polish teachers who dared to speak Polish in their classrooms were dismissed, imprisoned, or exiled. Polish books were confiscated and burned. Speaking Polish became an act of resistance. Polish history, the great sweep of kings and queens, battles and triumphs, the Commonwealth that had once stretched from the Baltic to the Black Sea, all of it was forbidden. Students were taught instead that Poland had never truly existed, that it had always been a backward region destined to be absorbed by greater powers, that Russian rule was a civilizing force bringing order to chaos. Polish literature, the poetry and novels that expressed the soul of the nation, was banned. Possessing a book by Mickiewicz or Słowacki, the great romantic poets who had written about Polish freedom and identity, could result in arrest. The written word became dangerous, precious, something to be hidden and treasured. Russian officials supervised classrooms, appearing without warning to question students, to test their loyalty to the Tsar. Teachers lived in constant fear, knowing that a single slip, a moment when they used a Polish word instead of a Russian one, could cost them their position, their freedom, their lives. The goal was simple and monstrous: to erase Polish identity entirely, to make the Poles forget they had ever been a nation, to transform them into docile subjects of the Russian Empire who spoke Russian, thought in Russian, and felt nothing but gratitude for the privilege of Russian rule. Within a generation or two, the Russians believed there would be no more Poles, only Russian speakers who happened to live in the former Polish territories. But the Poles resisted. Not with armies, those had failed, but with quiet, stubborn, daily acts of cultural preservation. In the privacy of their homes, they spoke Polish. They taught their children Polish history from smuggled books. They gathered in secret to read Polish poetry, to sing Polish songs, to remember. The occupation was brutal, but it could not enter every home, could not monitor every whispered conversation. Polish identity survived in the cracks and shadows, passed from parent to child like a precious heirloom. Into this city of occupation and resistance, of repression and secret defiance, Maria Sklodowska was born. The apartment where she came into the world was on Frita Street in Warsaw's Old Town, a neighbourhood that had stood for centuries, surviving wars and occupations, fires and floods. The buildings were old, solid structures of stone and brick, their facades bearing the scars of history. Number 16. Frita Street was a substantial building, 4 stories tall, with arched doorways and high-ceilinged rooms. The Sklodowski family occupied an apartment on one of the upper floors, a spacious home by the standards of the day, though not luxurious. There was a parlour for receiving guests, bedrooms for the children, a dining room where the family gathered for meals. The windows looked out onto the narrow street below, where horse-drawn carriages clattered over cobblestones, and vendors called out their wares. This was not the home of the destitute, but neither was it the home of the wealthy. The Sklodowskis were part of Poland's intelligentsia, the educated middle class that formed the backbone of Polish resistance to Russification. These were teachers, doctors, lawyers, writers, people who valued education and culture, who preserved Polish language and literature in their homes even as the Russian authorities tried to stamp it out in public. The intelligentsia lived in a precarious position. They were educated enough to understand what had been lost when Poland disappeared from the map, patriotic enough to resent the occupation, but practical enough to know that open resistance meant death or exile. So they resisted quietly, through education, through culture, through the simple act of remaining Polish in a world that wanted them to be Russian. Into this occupied city, into this atmosphere of oppression and resistance, Maria Sklodowska was born. Her parents named her Maria after her mother, though she would later adopt the French version of her name, Marie, when she moved to Paris. The name Sklodowski means, roughly, from Sklody, a reference to the family's landed gentry origins, though by the time of Maria's birth the family had no land and little money. The apartment where Maria was born was on Frita Street in Warsaw's Old Town, a neighbourhood of narrow cobblestone streets and buildings that had stood for centuries. Number 16. Frita Street was a substantial building, and the Sklodowski family occupied a spacious apartment within it. This was not the home of the destitute, but neither was it the home of the wealthy. The Sklodowskis were part of Poland's intelligentsia, the educated middle class that preserved Polish culture and identity even under occupation. Maria's father, Władysław Sklodowski, was a teacher of mathematics and physics at a gymnasium, a secondary school. He was a learned man who spoke several languages, collected scientific instruments, and believed passionately in the power of education. He was also a Polish patriot who had supported the January uprising, though not with arms. His patriotism would cost him dearly. Over the years, as the Russian authorities tightened their grip, Władysław would lose position after position, demoted for the crime of being too Polish, too sympathetic to his students, too unwilling to collaborate fully with the occupation. Maria's mother, Bronisława Sklodowska, was an even more remarkable figure. She was the director of a prestigious girls' boarding school in Warsaw, one of the few positions of real authority open to women in that time and place. She was elegant, cultured, and deeply religious, a woman who ran a school with a firm hand while raising 5 children. She played the piano beautifully and sang in a clear, lovely voice. She was everything a proper lady of her class should be. But Bronisława carried a terrible secret. Years before Maria's birth, she had contracted tuberculosis, the wasting disease that killed more people in the 19th century than any other illness. By the time Maria was born, Bronisława's tuberculosis was advanced. She was thin, pale, often feverish. She coughed constantly. And because tuberculosis was highly contagious, she lived in a kind of quarantine within her own home. From her earliest memories, Maria could not remember her mother kissing her. Bronisława, desperate to protect her children from infection, refused all physical contact with them. She would sit with them, read to them, supervise their studies, but she would not embrace them, would not kiss them good night, would not hold them when they cried. It was a heartbreaking sacrifice, and it left a wound in Maria that never entirely healed. Maria was the youngest of 5 children. First came Zofia, called Zosia, bright and beautiful. Then came Józef, the only son, serious and studious. Then came Bronislawa, called Bronia, who would become Maria's closest companion and dearest friend. Then came Helena, called Hela, gentle and artistic. And finally, in November 1867, came Maria, called Mania in Polish, the baby of the family. The Sklodowski household was a place of learning and culture. Every evening after the children had finished their schoolwork, Ladislaw would gather them and read aloud. He read Polish literature, forbidden under the occupation, and the children would listen with fierce attention, knowing that these books, these stories, this language were acts of resistance. He read poetry and history, plays and novels. He taught them about Poland's past, about the great heroes and terrible tragedies of their nation. He also taught them science. Wladyslaw's apartment was filled with scientific instruments, glass tubes and scales, barometers and magnets, items he had collected over his years of teaching. The children were allowed to examine these objects, to ask questions about how they worked. Wladyslaw believed that education was not merely about memorizing facts, but about understanding the world, about asking why and how and what if. Maria, the youngest, was the most curious of all. She would spend hours examining the instruments in her father's collection, turning them over in her small hands, trying to understand their purpose. She was a quiet child, observing more than she spoke, but her grey eyes missed nothing. When Wladyslaw explained a concept, she grasped it immediately. When he posed a problem, she worked at it with silent determination until she solved it. But the Sklodowski household, for all its love of learning, was not a happy place. Bronislawa's illness cast a shadow over everything. The children lived in fear that any day their mother might worsen, might be taken from them, and the family's financial situation was precarious. Wladyslaw's patriotism had made him suspect in the eyes of the Russian authorities, and he had been demoted repeatedly, each demotion bringing a smaller salary, a less prestigious position. By the time Maria was 6 years old, the family had been forced to move from their spacious apartment to smaller quarters, and then smaller still. Wladyslaw, desperate to make ends meet, had taken in boarders, boys from the country whose families paid for them to attend school in Warsaw. The apartment was crowded, noisy, chaotic. Privacy vanished. Maria, who craved quiet and solitude, had nowhere to retreat. And then the tragedies began. In January 1876, when Maria was 8 years old, her oldest sister Zofia contracted typhus from one of the boarders. The disease struck suddenly and savagely. Zofia, just 14 years old, beautiful and brilliant, was dead within days. The family was shattered. Wladyslaw, who had brought the boarders into their home, was consumed with guilt. Bronislawa, already fragile, seemed to crumble. And 2 years later, in May 1878, Bronislawa herself died. Tuberculosis, which had stalked her for years, finally claimed her. She was 42 years old. Maria was not yet 11. The death of her mother was the defining trauma of Maria's childhood. Years later, she would write that she had cried for days, unable to comprehend that her mother was truly gone, unable to accept that she would never again hear her mother's voice, never receive the embrace that had been withheld her entire life. Bronislawa's death also shook Maria's faith. Her mother had been deeply religious, attending church regularly, praying constantly. And God had not saved her. God had not spared Zofia. Maria, young as she was, began to question the religion that had been so central to her mother's life. She would later describe herself as agnostic, unable to believe in a God who would allow such suffering. But if Maria lost her faith in God, she found something to replace it. Faith in knowledge, in science, in the power of the human mind to understand the world. Education became her religion. Learning became her salvation. And the dream that began to form in her mind even as a child was the dream of going to university, of becoming a scientist, of adding to the sum of human knowledge. It was an impossible dream. There was no university in Russian-occupied Poland that admitted women. The nearest university that did was in Paris, and Paris might as well have been on the moon for a girl with no money and no prospects. But Maria Sklodowska was not a girl who accepted impossibility. Maria's education began early and intensely. At 4 years old, she taught herself to read, astonishing her family by picking up her older sister's primer and working through it on her own. By 5, she was reading adult books, devouring anything she could find. Her father, recognizing her exceptional abilities, encouraged her, bringing home books from the school where he taught, guiding her through mathematics and science. At 10, Maria enrolled in a private girls' school run by a woman named Madame Sikorska. The school was a curious institution, operating in the shadow of Russian censorship. Officially, it taught only what the occupation permitted, but Madame Sikorska, like so many Polish educators of that era, was a master of quiet resistance. In secret, hidden from the Russian inspectors who might arrive at any moment, she taught Polish history, Polish literature, the Polish language. Madame Sikorska herself was a remarkable woman, one of the few female school directors in Warsaw, a position she had fought hard to attain, and defended fiercely against Russian attempts to close her school. She was in her 40s when Maria knew her, a stern but fair woman who believed passionately that education was the key to Polish survival. If the Russians could erase Polish culture from the schools, they would win. If Polish educators could preserve that culture in secret, passing it from generation to generation, Poland would survive. The school occupied a building not far from Frita Street, close enough that Maria could walk there each morning. The classrooms were on the upper floors, large rooms with high ceilings and tall windows that let in the northern light. The students, perhaps 60 girls in all, sat at wooden desks arranged in rows, their slates and copybooks before them. The day began officially with Russian language instruction. The students would recite Russian verbs, read from Russian primers, answer questions in Russian about Russian history and geography. They learned about the great Tsars, about the glory of the Russian Empire, about their privilege in being part of such a magnificent nation. They learned these lessons well, too well, because their survival depended on it. But after the Russian lessons came the real education. Madame Sikorska had installed a system of lookouts, trusted students posted at the windows and in the hallways, watching for the approach of Russian inspectors. The inspectors came irregularly, sometimes weekly, sometimes not for months, always unannounced. The goal was to catch the schools teaching forbidden subjects, to find evidence of resistance. When the lookout spotted an inspector approaching, usually recognizable by his uniform and official bearing, she would give a signal. Perhaps a particular knock on the classroom door, perhaps a bell rung in a certain pattern, perhaps simply a word called out. Instantly the forbidden books would vanish. Each desk had a hidden compartment, and into these the Polish books would go, replaced with the approved Russian texts. The teacher would switch mid-sentence from Polish to Russian, from teaching Polish history to Russian history, from discussing Polish poetry to Russian poetry. When the inspector entered, he would find a classroom of the girls dutifully studying Russian, utterly loyal to the Tsar. Maria excelled at this dangerous game. She was a brilliant student, perhaps the most brilliant Madame Sikorska had ever taught. She absorbed knowledge with frightening speed, whether it was Russian lessons or Polish ones. Mathematics, literature, history, languages. She mastered them all. Her memory was extraordinary. She could read a page of text once and recite it back perfectly. She could solve complex mathematical problems in her head, working through the steps mentally while other students struggled with slate and chalk. Languages came to her naturally. She already spoke Polish and Russian fluently. By 12, she was reading French literature in the original French, German philosophy in German, English novels in English. She taught herself these languages largely from books, reading grammar texts and literature simultaneously, absorbing vocabulary and structure through immersion. But it was mathematics and science that truly captured her imagination. Her father, Władysław, had taught her the basics of arithmetic and geometry when she was very young, and she had loved the clarity and logic of it, the way mathematical problems had definite answers that could be proven. There was no ambiguity in mathematics, no room for opinion or interpretation. 2 + 2 was 4, always and forever, regardless of what any Russian inspector might say. As she grew older and her mathematical abilities developed, she moved on to algebra, trigonometry, and the beginnings of calculus. Her father would bring home textbooks from the gymnasium where he taught, and Maria would work through them on her own, solving problem after problem, pushing herself to understand ever more complex concepts. Science was equally fascinating. Her father's collection of scientific instruments, those glass tubes and balances and magnets he had acquired over years of teaching, were like holy relics to young Maria. She would examine them for hours, trying to understand their purpose and function. When her father explained the principles behind them, the physics of mechanics or optics or magnetism, Maria felt a thrill of recognition. The world operated according to laws, invisible but discoverable laws, and these instruments were tools for uncovering those laws. She was particularly drawn to physics, the science that explained everything from why objects fell to the ground to why the sky was blue, from how machines worked to what light was made of. Physics seemed to Maria like the language in which the universe was written, and she desperately wanted to learn that language, to understand the fundamental principles that governed reality. But there was no way for a girl in Warsaw to pursue physics seriously. The Russian-controlled University of Warsaw did not admit women. The gymnasium where her father taught admitted only boys. Maria could read books about physics, could solve problems in textbooks, but she could not attend lectures, could not work in laboratories, could not study with real scientists. This limitation gnawed at her. She had a gift for science, she knew it, could feel it in the ease with which she grasped concepts that baffled others. But what good was a gift that could never be used? She was a girl, born in the wrong place at the wrong time, and the world had no use for her abilities. The incident with the Russian inspector when she was 13 was emblematic of her situation. She stood at the front of the class, this brilliant young girl who could read in 5 languages, solve advanced mathematics problems, explain scientific principles, and she was forced to recite propaganda about the glorious Russian Empire, to pretend that the occupation was a blessing, to deny the very identity that her mother and sister had died defending. When the inspector left and she began to cry, it was not just shame and rage she felt, though there was plenty of both. It was also frustration, the terrible frustration of being trapped, of having a mind capable of so much, but a life that would allow her so little. The teachers at Madame Sikorska's school recognized Maria's exceptional abilities and did their best to nurture them. They gave her extra books to read, harder problems to solve, encouraged her to push herself beyond the standard curriculum, but they also knew, as Maria knew, that there was a limit to what they could offer her. Without access to a real university, without the opportunity to work with real scientists and real equipment, Maria's education would always be incomplete. Maria graduated from the gymnasium in 1883, having completed the full secondary course of study. The graduation ceremony was held in a large hall, with the students in their best dresses and the parents in attendance. Maria stood on the stage to receive her gold medal, awarded to the top student in the class, and she felt simultaneously proud and hollow. She had worked so hard, achieved so much, and it meant almost nothing. The gold medal could not get her into university. The gold medal could not change the fact that she was a woman in occupied Poland with no money and no prospects. After graduation, she was supposed to figure out what to do with her life. For boys in her position, the path was clear. University, then a profession. For girls, the options were limited. Marriage, perhaps teaching in a girls' school if you were educated, or domestic service if you were not. Marriage required a dowry and connections, neither of which Maria possessed. Teaching in a girls' school required connections as well, and the positions were few and poorly paid. Maria, exhausted from years of intensive study and mourning the deaths of her mother and sister, decided to take a break. In the summer of 1883, she went to stay with relatives in the countryside in a small village where life moved at a slower pace, and the Russian occupation felt less oppressive. It was the first time in her life that she allowed herself to simply exist without striving, without studying, without constantly pushing herself towards some distant goal. She attended parties and dances, activities she had never had time for in Warsaw. She flirted with local boys, went for long walks in the forests, picked wild flowers, swam in the river. She was briefly a normal teenage girl, enjoying the simple pleasures of youth. One local boy, a cousin or family friend, became particularly attentive, and Maria found herself enjoying his attention. They would go for walks together, talk for hours about nothing important, laugh at silly jokes. It was pleasant, comfortable, and utterly devoid of intellectual substance. After a few weeks, Maria found herself growing restless. She enjoyed the relaxation, but she missed learning, missed the satisfaction of solving a difficult problem, missed having something meaningful to work toward. By the autumn, she was back in Warsaw, and the question of her future had become urgent. She was 17 years old, highly educated, and going absolutely nowhere. Poland offered her nothing. Paris offered everything. The Sorbonne admitted women, though in very small numbers, and Paris was home to some of the greatest scientists in Europe. But Paris was impossible. It might as well have been on the moon. Her father had no money. Family was barely surviving on his meagre salary. There was no way to fund even a year of study in Paris, let alone the full course of a university education. And then her older sister Bronia proposed a plan, a pact between sisters that would change both their lives. Bronia wanted to study medicine, to become a doctor. Like Maria, she could not do this in Poland. Like Maria, she had no money. But Bronia had an idea, desperate and ambitious, but possible. Maria would work as a governess, taking a position in a wealthy household and sending her earnings to Bronia in Paris. Bronia would use that money to pay for medical school. It would take years, 4 years at minimum for medical school, possibly longer. When Bronia finished her studies and established herself as a doctor, she would in turn support Maria, allowing her to come to Paris and study at the Sorbonne. It would require immense sacrifice from both sisters. Maria would have to defer her dreams for years, would have to live in someone else's home, subject to someone else's rules, earning barely enough to survive while sending most of her wages to Bronia. Bronia would have to live on almost nothing in Paris, studying medicine while surviving on the meagre funds Maria could send. But it was possible, and possibility was all Maria needed. In September 1885, at the age of 17, Maria Sklodowska took a position as a governess in Warsaw. It was the beginning of what she would later call the cruelest years of her life. The position Maria accepted was with a family named Zorowski, wealthy landowners who owned a large estate in a village called Szczuki, about 100 kilometers north of Warsaw. The Zorowskis had several children who needed instruction, and they hired Maria to teach them. The salary was modest but sufficient for Maria's needs. She would live with the family, receive room and board, and send nearly all her wages to Bronia in Paris. Maria arrived at Sztuki in late 1885 to find a world utterly different from anything she had known. The Żurowski estate was vast, a manor house surrounded by fields and forests, a self-contained world where the family lived in comfort while the local peasants worked the land. It was, in miniature, the old feudal Poland that the partitions had destroyed, preserved here in this isolated corner of the countryside. The Żurowskis were kind enough to Maria, treating her not quite as a servant, but certainly not as an equal. She was educated, intelligent, clearly above the station of a typical governess, and this made her position awkward. She ate meals with the family but was not included in their social gatherings. She taught the children but was expected to defer to their parents in all things. She was neither servant nor guest, but something in between, a liminal figure in a household that did not quite know what to make of her. Maria threw herself into teaching. She was responsible for the education of the two oldest Żurowski daughters, girls of perhaps 12 and 14, and she taught them with the same intensity her father had brought to her own education. She instructed them in mathematics and literature, history and languages. She spoke to them in Polish, teaching them pride in their language and culture, though she was careful to ensure they also learned Russian and German, the languages that would be required of them in occupied Poland. But teaching the Żurowski children was not Maria's only work. The village of Sztuki was poor, and the local peasant children had no school, no education whatsoever. Most were illiterate, destined to work the land as their parents did, trapped in ignorance and poverty. Maria looked at these children and saw a chance to do something meaningful. She began teaching them secretly. Every evening, after her duties to the Żurowski children were complete, she would gather the peasant children in a small room and teach them to read and write in Polish. It was illegal, of course. Teaching Polish to peasant children was exactly the sort of nationalist activity the Russian authorities wanted to stamp out. If Maria had been caught, she could have been arrested, imprisoned, exiled to Siberia. But she did it anyway. Night after night she taught children whose parents could not read, children who had never held a book, children for whom education was the only hope of escaping the grinding poverty of rural life. She did it for free, refusing any payment, considering it her patriotic duty. Years later, she would describe this as one of the most rewarding things she ever did. Yet for all the satisfaction she found in teaching, Maria was desperately lonely. She missed her family. She missed Warsaw. She missed conversation with people who understood her, who shared her love of learning. The Żurowskis were pleasant but intellectually limited. There were no libraries nearby, few books worth reading. Maria was starving for intellectual stimulation. She wrote long letters to her family, letters filled with longing and frustration. She described the beauty of the countryside, the changing seasons, the snow that fell deep in winter. But she also described her isolation, her sense that time was passing and she was accomplishing nothing, that her mind was atrophying in this place where no one cared about science or literature or ideas. And then, in her second year with the Żurowskis, something happened that made everything worse. She fell in love. The Żurowskis had a son named Kazimierz, a young man studying mathematics at the University of Warsaw. He was handsome, intelligent, kind, and he was drawn to Maria immediately. Here was a young woman unlike any he had ever met, educated, passionate, brilliant. They talked for hours about books and ideas. They went for walks in the countryside. They fell deeply in love. Maria, who had never had a serious romantic relationship, was overwhelmed by the intensity of her feelings. For the first time, she imagined a different future, one where she would not have to sacrifice everything for her studies, where she could have both love and learning, where she could marry Kazimierz and perhaps continue her education with his support. They talked about marriage. Kazimierz wanted to marry her. Maria wanted to marry him. They made plans, imagining a life together. And then Kazimierz told his parents. The reaction was swift and brutal. The Żurawskis were horrified. Their son wanted to marry the governess, a girl with no money, no family, no prospects, a girl who worked for wages. It was unthinkable. They forbade the marriage absolutely. If Kazimierz persisted, they would disinherit him, cut him off entirely. Kazimierz, faced with this ultimatum, collapsed. He loved Maria, but he could not give up his family, his inheritance, his future. He promised his parents he would end the relationship. Maria was devastated, not just by the loss of love, though that was painful enough, but by the rejection, by the reminder of her status, of what she lacked. She was poor, she was nobody, and no matter how brilliant she was, that would never be enough for people like the Żurawskis. But she could not leave immediately. She had a contract with the family, and breaking it would mean sacrificing the salary she was sending to Bronia in Paris. She could not afford to act on her heartbreak. She had to stay, had to continue living in the same house with Kazimierz, seeing him every day, knowing that he had chosen his family's money over her. It was torture, but Maria endured it. For 2 more years she remained with the Żurawskis, teaching their daughters, seeing Kazimierz at meals, never speaking to him of what had happened. She buried her feelings, focused on her work, and continued sending money to Bronia. Years later, she would write that this experience taught her a crucial lesson, that she could not depend on anyone but herself, that marriage and romantic love were luxuries she could not afford, that her only hope of escaping poverty and powerlessness was through her own mind, her own work, her own achievement. She would have to save herself. In 1889, after nearly 4 years as a governess, Maria finally left the Żurawskis. She took another position with a family in Warsaw, closer to her father and siblings, and continued working, continued saving, continued waiting. Bronia was almost finished with medical school. Soon, very soon, it would be Maria's turn. The waiting stretched into 1890, then 1891. Maria was now 23 years old. Most women her age were married with children. She was still living in someone else's home, still teaching other people's children, still putting her own dreams on hold. The frustration was almost unbearable, but she kept herself intellectually alive. She attended secret classes offered by the Flying University, an underground educational network that provided higher education to Polish students who were barred from official universities. These classes moved from location to location to avoid Russian detection, hence the name. Maria studied mathematics and science with professors who risked their freedom to teach. It was not a real university, but it was something. And she began to teach herself physics and chemistry in earnest, reading every textbook she could find, working through problems late into the night. She was preparing herself, building the foundation she would need when she finally reached Paris. And then, in the autumn of 1891, a letter arrived from Bronia. She had finished medical school. She had married a fellow Polish medical student named Kazimierz Dluski. They were established in Paris, and there was room for Maria. It was time. In November 1891, Maria Sklodowska boarded a train in Warsaw bound for Paris. She was 23 years old. She had saved a little money from her years as a governess. Not much, but enough to survive for a while. She had the promise of room and board with Bronia and Kazimierz. And she had a hunger for knowledge so fierce it burned away every other consideration. The journey took 3 days. Maria travelled 4th class, the cheapest ticket, in a train car packed with peasants and labourers. She sat on a wooden bench with her few belongings, eating bread and apples she had brought with her, barely sleeping. She crossed the German lands, then entered France, watching the landscape change through the window. And on a cold November day in 1891, Maria Sklodowska stepped off the train at the Gare du Nord in Paris and began the most important phase of her life. Paris in the 1890s was the intellectual capital of Europe. The city hummed with new ideas, new movements, new possibilities. The Impressionists had revolutionized painting. Poets and novelists gathered in cafes to argue about art and philosophy. Scientists at the Sorbonne and other institutions were pushing the boundaries of chemistry and physics, making discoveries that would transform the world. And into this city of light and learning came a young Polish woman who spoke barely passable French, who had almost no money, who knew no one except her sister, but who was determined to become a scientist. Maria registered at the Sorbonne as Maria Sklodowska, adopting the French version of her first name. She enrolled in the Faculty of Sciences to study physics. She was one of perhaps 30 women in a student body of thousands, and she was certainly the only woman in most of her classes. The other students stared at her, whispered about her. A woman studying physics was a curiosity, barely acceptable. But Marie did not care about their stares or whispers. She had not come to Paris to make friends. She'd come to learn. She attended every lecture, sat in the front row, took meticulous notes. The professors at the Sorbonne were among the finest in Europe, and they taught physics at a level Marie had never encountered. She was exhilarated and overwhelmed. Her French was poor, and she struggled to follow the lectures at first. Her mathematical preparation, cobbled together from textbooks and underground classes, had gaps. She had to work twice as hard as the French students just to keep up. So she worked twice as hard, then 3 times as hard. Marie quickly realised that living with Bronia and her husband was not conducive to study. Their apartment in the Latin Quarter was warm and comfortable, filled with Polish expatriates who gathered in the evenings to talk and argue and socialise. Bronia and Kazimierz were kind and welcoming, always inviting friends over, always trying to include Marie in their social life. But Marie did not want social life. She wanted silence and solitude so she could study. The conversations, however interesting, were a distraction. The warmth and comfort made her feel lazy. She needed to be cold and hungry and alone. She needed to suffer because suffering kept her focused. In 1892, after a few months with Bronia, Marie moved out. She found a tiny room in a garret on the 6th floor of a building on the Rue Flatters in the Latin Quarter. It was one of the cheapest rooms in one of the cheapest neighbourhoods in Paris. A single room barely large enough for a bed, a table, a chair and a small stove. The room had no heat except what the small stove could provide, and Marie had little money for coal. In the brutal Paris winters, the temperature in the room often dropped below freezing. Marie would wake to find ice in the bowl of water she kept by her bed. She wore every piece of clothing she owned to bed, piling her coat and spare dress over the thin blanket. She was constantly hungry. Her budget allowed for the barest necessities, a small amount of bread, some fruit, occasionally a bit of chocolate for energy. She would go days eating nothing but bread and tea. She was too absorbed in her studies to notice her own hunger until she felt faint. On several occasions, she collapsed from malnutrition. Bronia would find her, unconscious on the floor of her garret, and force her to come home, to eat a proper meal, to rest. Marie would comply just long enough to recover, then return to her garret and her books. But she was happy. For the first time in her life, she was exactly where she wanted to be, doing exactly what she wanted to do. She was learning physics from the greatest minds in Europe. She had access to laboratories, to equipment, to libraries full of books. The cold and hunger were minor inconveniences compared to the richness of what she was learning. Her days followed a strict routine. She woke early, ate a piece of bread, and walked to the Sorbonne. She attended lectures all morning and into the afternoon, then spent hours in the library reading and studying. In the evening, she returned to her garret and studied by lamplight, until she could no longer keep her eyes open. Then she slept a few hours and began again. She had no social life, no hobbies, no distractions. She did not attend parties or go to the theatre. She did not join student clubs. She spoke to almost no one except when asking questions of her professors. She was entirely focused on a single goal: to master physics, to prove that she could do this, to justify the sacrifice of all those years as a governess, all the money she'd sent to Bronia, all the dreams she had deferred. In 1893, after 2 years of this monastic existence, Marie took her examinations in physics. She finished first in her class. The only woman, the immigrant with imperfect French, had outscored every French student, every man who'd been educated at the finest lycées in France. It was an astonishing achievement. She was awarded a licenciat, the French equivalent of a master's degree in physics. She should have been satisfied. She had accomplished what she set out to do, but Marie was not satisfied. She wanted more. She decided to pursue a second degree in mathematics. She registered again at the Sorbonne, attended more lectures, studied more textbooks, worked more problems. The hunger, the cold, the poverty continued, but so did the learning. In 1894, she took her examinations in mathematics. This time she finished second in her class. Still extraordinary, but not first. For Marie, who expected perfection from herself, it was almost a disappointment. Almost. But by the summer of 1894, something else had entered Marie's carefully ordered life. Something she had not planned for, something she had convinced herself she did not need. She met a man named Pierre Curie, and her life changed forever. Marie had been asked by a Polish friend to find laboratory space for a project involving the magnetic properties of different steels. She needed access to equipment and expertise, and she had been introduced to various scientists in Paris who might be able to help. One of these was Pierre Curie, a physicist who worked at the School of Physics and Chemistry, an institution less prestigious than the Sorbonne but with excellent laboratories. Pierre Curie was 35 years old, 8 years older than Marie. He was tall, thin, with a wispy beard and gentle eyes. He had been educated at home by his father and had never attended a traditional school. This gave him an outsider's perspective on science, a willingness to question established ideas that more conventionally trained physicists might accept without examination. Pierre had already made significant contributions to physics. He had discovered piezoelectricity with his brother Jacques, showing that certain crystals produce electrical charges when subjected to mechanical stress. He had done important work on crystallography and magnetism. He was recognized as a brilliant experimenter, a man with an almost intuitive understanding of physical phenomena. But Pierre had not achieved the recognition he deserved. He was shy, socially awkward, uninterested in academic politics. He had not pursued a professorship at a major university. He had no gift for self-promotion. He was content to work in his laboratory, to pursue the questions that interested him, and to ignore the rest. When Pierre met Marie, he was immediately struck by her. Here was a woman who shared his passion for science, who understood physics at a level he had rarely encountered, who was willing to dedicate herself entirely to the pursuit of knowledge. They began to talk, and the conversations went on for hours. Pierre was drawn to Marie intellectually first, but soon the attraction became deeper. He began to dream of a partnership, both scientific and personal. He imagined working with Marie, combining their talents and efforts toward discoveries neither could make alone. For Marie, the attraction was more complicated. She'd been hurt by Kazimierz Zorowski. She'd convinced herself that romance was a distraction, that she could not afford the complications of love. She had a plan: finish her studies, return to Poland, perhaps teach at a girls' school, live a useful and quiet life dedicated to education. But Pierre persisted, gently and patiently. He did not pressure her, did not demand anything. He simply made it clear that he loved her, that he wanted to share his life with her, that he could imagine no greater happiness than working alongside her in a laboratory. He wrote her letters when she returned to Poland for the summer of 1894, letters that mixed scientific discussion with declarations of affection. He proposed that if she could not imagine living in France, he would move to Poland. He would learn Polish, find work there, be with her wherever she needed to be. It was this offer, this willingness to sacrifice his own career and comfort for her sake, that finally convinced Marie. Kazimierz had chosen his family's approval over her. Pierre was willing to give up everything for her. The contrast was stark. In July 1895, Maria Sklodowska married Pierre Curie in a simple civil ceremony in Sceaux, the Paris suburb where Pierre's family lived. There was no church wedding, no white dress, no celebration. Marie wore a dark blue outfit, practical and durable, something she could wear in the laboratory afterward. The ceremony took 5 minutes. Afterward, Marie and Pierre went on a bicycle tour of the French countryside, pedalling through small villages and staying in country inns, talking about science and their future. They returned to Paris and moved into a small apartment near the School of Physics and Chemistry where Pierre worked. It was a modest place, 3 rooms, sparsely furnished. Marie had no interest in domestic decoration. She saw housekeeping as a necessary chore to be completed as efficiently as possible so she could get back to science. They lived simply, almost ascetically. Meals were basic, often just bread and soup. They had no servants, no luxuries. Marie cooked and cleaned with the same fierce efficiency she brought to everything else, refusing to waste time on elaborate meals or fussy housekeeping. She wanted to work. And work she did. Pierre arranged for Marie to have access to a laboratory space at the School of Physics and Chemistry. It was not much, just a corner of a room, but it was a laboratory. Marie began working on her doctoral thesis. She needed a research topic, something original and significant, something that would allow her to make a real contribution to science. And then, in 1896, a French physicist named Henri Becquerel made a curious discovery. He found that a uranium compound was emitting some kind of invisible radiation that could expose photographic plates even when the plates were wrapped in thick paper. Becquerel had stumbled on this phenomenon accidentally and had published a brief paper about it, then largely moved on to other things. But Marie Curie read that paper and saw an opportunity. This strange radiation was a mystery. No one understood what it was or where it came from. Investigating it might lead nowhere, or it might lead to something important. It was a gamble, but Marie decided to take it. She would study this mysterious radiation from uranium and try to understand its nature. It was the decision that would define her life and change science forever. Marie began her investigation of uranium radiation in late 1897. She set up her work in a small ground-floor room at the School of Physics and Chemistry where Pierre worked. It was not really a laboratory, more of a storage room that had been cleared out for her use. It was cold, damp, and poorly ventilated, but it had a stone floor suitable for heavy equipment, and that was enough. Pierre had developed an extremely sensitive instrument called an electrometer, and Marie used this to measure the radiation being emitted by different uranium samples. The principle was simple. The radiation made the air slightly conductive, and the electrometer could detect this conductivity with great precision. By measuring how conductive the air became in the presence of different samples, Marie could quantify the strength of the radiation. She worked methodically, testing sample after sample. First, she confirmed Becquerel's results. Uranium compounds did indeed emit radiation. Then she made her first important discovery. The amount of radiation depended only on the amount of uranium in the sample, not on what compound the uranium was part of. Whether the uranium was in a salt, an oxide, or a pure metal, it emitted the same amount of radiation for the same amount of uranium. This was significant. It suggested that the radiation was coming from the uranium atoms themselves, not from any chemical reaction or molecular structure. It was an atomic property. This was a revolutionary idea. At the time, atoms were still considered the smallest indivisible units of matter. The idea that atoms had internal structure, that they could emit energy spontaneously, challenged fundamental assumptions about physics. Marie pressed on. She began testing other elements to see if any besides uranium emitted radiation. She tested dozens of elements and compounds. Most emitted nothing. But then she tested thorium and found that it too emitted radiation similar to uranium. She had discovered a second radioactive element, and she coined the term radioactive to describe this property. The word was her invention, and it entered the scientific vocabulary immediately. But the most important discovery came when Marie tested pitchblende, a uranium ore. Logically, pitchblende should have emitted radiation proportional to its uranium content. But when Marie measured it, she found that pitchblende was far more radioactive than its uranium content could account for. Some pitchblende samples were 2 or 3 or even 4 times more radioactive than pure uranium. There was only one possible explanation. Pitchblende must contain another element, something besides uranium, something highly radioactive that was present in tiny quantities, an unknown element. Marie reported this finding to Pierre, who was immediately intrigued. The discovery of a new element would be a major achievement. Together, they decided to find it. Pierre set aside his own research on crystals and joined Marie in her investigation. They made a formidable team. Marie was meticulous and determined, willing to do the tedious work of processing tons of material to extract microscopic quantities of the mystery element. Pierre was an intuitive physicist with a gift for designing experiments and understanding theoretical implications. They began the grueling work of chemically separating pitchblende into its components. They would take a sample of pitchblende, dissolve it in acid, then systematically separate the different elements through a series of chemical reactions. After each separation, they would measure the radioactivity of each fraction to see which one contained the mystery element. The work was slow and laborious, but by July 1898, they had found something. They had isolated a fraction that was several hundred times more radioactive than uranium. This fraction seemed to contain bismuth, but it was far more radioactive than bismuth should be. They announced the discovery of a new element, which they named polonium after Marie's beloved Poland. It was her tribute to the country that did not exist on maps but lived in her heart. But they were not done. As they continued to process pitchblende, they found that even after removing the polonium, there was still radioactivity they could not account for. There must be yet another element, even more radioactive than polonium. In December 1898, they announced the probable existence of this second new element, which they named radium, from the Latin word for ray. But probably was not enough. To prove radium existed, they needed to isolate it in pure form, to determine its atomic weight, to show beyond doubt that it was a distinct element. This would require processing enormous quantities of pitchblende. Radium was present in such tiny amounts, perhaps 1 part in several million, that they would need to work with tons of ore to extract even a fraction of a gram of pure radium. They obtained the ore from the Austrian government, which controlled mines in Bohemia, where pitchblende was extracted for its uranium content. The residue after uranium extraction was essentially waste, and the Curies were able to get it cheaply. Soon tons of brown pitchblende residue were being delivered to the School of Physics and Chemistry. But where could they process such quantities? The small room where Marie had been working was far too small. They needed space, lots of it, and the school had nothing suitable available. Finally, the director offered them an old dissecting shed in the courtyard, a wooden building with a glass roof that leaked when it rained. It was sweltering in summer, freezing in winter, and completely unsuitable as a laboratory. But it was space, and the Curies took it. They moved their equipment into the shed, set up benches and apparatus, and began the work that would consume the next 4 years of their lives. The work was brutal, physically exhausting and dangerous, though they did not yet know how dangerous. Marie would spend entire days stirring enormous vats of boiling ore with an iron rod nearly as tall as herself. The vats held 20 kilograms of material at a time, sometimes more, and she had to stir constantly to keep the chemical reactions proceeding evenly. The iron rod was heavy, requiring both hands and considerable strength to manipulate. The work was back-breaking, and the heat from the vats combined with the steam and chemical fumes was overwhelming, especially in summer when the glass roof of the shed turned the space into an oven. The process itself was complex and required precise attention. First, the pitchblende residue had to be ground into a powder. Then it was dissolved in acid, creating thick, noxious fumes that filled the shed. The solution was then subjected to a series of chemical separations, adding different reagents, precipitating out different components, filtering and crystallizing, always testing each fraction for radioactivity to track where the radium was concentrating. Each step had to be done carefully, precisely. A mistake meant wasted material, wasted time, wasted effort, and the quantities were enormous. To get even a tiny amount of radium, they had to process tons of pitchblende. Marie would spend days on a single batch, boiling, stirring, filtering, only to end up with a few grams of material for the next round of processing. After boiling, filtering, precipitating and dissolving, they would end up with smaller and smaller fractions of material, each more radioactive than the last. They would measure each fraction with Pierre's electrometer, determine which elements it contained, through chemical tests plan the next round of separations. It was detective work as much as chemistry, following the radioactivity through the maze of chemical reactions, getting closer and closer to isolating pure radium. The physical conditions in the shed were appalling. In winter, the temperature inside was barely above freezing. Marie wore her coat while working, her fingers stiff with cold as she poured liquids and adjusted equipment. The moisture from the boiling vats would condense on the glass roof and drip down, creating puddles on the floor, making everything damp and miserable. In summer, the heat was oppressive, the glass roof intensifying the sun, turning the shed into a sweltering greenhouse. Marie would work for hours, sweat soaking through her clothes, her head aching from the heat and fumes. The shed had no ventilation, no fume hoods, no safety equipment of any kind. When Marie boiled acids or worked with volatile chemicals, the fumes simply filled the space. She would open the door for air, but there was no way to truly clear the atmosphere. She breathed these fumes for hours every day, breathing in acids and radioactive dust, her lungs and throat burning, coughing frequently. Marie and Pierre worked with radioactive materials with their bare hands, not understanding the danger. They had no concept of radioactive contamination or long-term exposure effects. They simply worked, handling the substances directly, stirring them, pouring them, tasting them occasionally when they needed to identify compounds by their chemical properties, the way chemists had always worked. The radioactive materials contaminated everything they touched. Their clothes became radioactive, their hands and faces became contaminated. They would go home at the end of the day carrying radiation with them, tracking it into their apartment, exposing themselves and their daughter to levels that would be considered catastrophic today. But they did not know, and in their ignorance, they found beauty in what was killing them. The radium and polonium preparations glowed in the dark, emitting a soft, ethereal blue-green light. This phosphorescence was caused by the radiation exciting the air molecules around the sample, making them emit visible light. It was beautiful, magical, unlike anything most people had ever seen. Marie would sometimes walk into the shed at night, when the lamps were out and the city was dark, and she would see jars and tubes glowing on the shelves, little points of light scattered through the darkness. She wrote later that these glowing tubes looked like faint fairy lights, beautiful and mysterious. She had no idea they represented death, that each glowing jar was emitting radiation that was tearing apart her cells, damaging her DNA, destroying her bone marrow. She would stand in the dark shed surrounded by these glowing samples and feel a sense of wonder and accomplishment. This was the fruit of their labour, the physical manifestation of a new force in nature, something that had always existed but that humanity had never perceived before. It was, in its way, a religious experience, standing in the presence of something fundamental and eternal. Pierre shared her sense of wonder. He would sometimes carry a small tube of radium solution in his pocket so he could show it to friends and colleagues, pulling it out in a darkened room and revealing its ghostly glow. It became something of a party trick, this glowing liquid that seemed to violate the normal laws of matter. People were amazed, delighted, fascinated. No one thought it might be dangerous. The radiation from these samples was intense enough to feel. Marie and Pierre both noticed that their hands became irritated after handling radioactive materials for extended periods. The skin would redden, become sensitive, sometimes blister. Pierre deliberately exposed a small area of his skin to intense radiation from a radium sample to see what would happen. A wound formed, took weeks to heal, and left a permanent scar. They documented this effect, noting that radium could destroy living tissue, but they did not make the connection between these localized effects and the possibility of systemic damage. They thought radiation was a local phenomenon, that as long as you were not directly touching the radioactive material or holding it near your skin for extended periods, you were safe. They did not understand that radiation permeated the air around radioactive samples, that it penetrated their bodies, that cumulative exposure over months and years could be deadly. So they kept working day after day, month after month. The shed became their world, the place where they spent most of their waking hours. They developed a rhythm, a routine. Marie would arrive early, start the day's work, prepare the materials for processing. Pierre would join her, and they would work together, sometimes talking through problems, often working in companionable silence, each knowing what needed to be done without discussion. They measured everything meticulously, keeping detailed records of each step, each measurement, each result. Marie filled notebook after notebook with data, recording the radioactivity of each fraction, the chemical composition, the next steps to be taken. These notebooks, preserved now in the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris, remain too radioactive to handle safely more than a century later. They must be kept in lead-lined boxes, and researchers who wish to consult them must sign liability waivers and wear protective equipment. The work was also expensive. The chemical reagents, the fuel for heating, the equipment, all cost money the Curies did not have. Pierre was still working his regular job at the School of Physics and Chemistry, earning a modest salary. Marie was not employed at all. They lived frugally, spent nothing on luxuries, and poured every spare franc into their research. And then, in September 1897, Marie had given birth to a daughter, Irene. Motherhood added another layer of complexity to Marie's life. She loved her daughter fiercely, but she also resented the time that childcare took from her work. She managed by being ruthlessly efficient, hiring a nurse to care for Irene during the day while she worked, spending evenings with her daughter, then returning to the laboratory when Irene slept. Pierre's father, Eugène Curie, moved in with them to help with childcare. Eugène was a doctor, a gentle and kind man who adored his granddaughter and supported his son and daughter-in-law's unconventional life. With his help, Marie was able to continue her work without entirely sacrificing her role as a mother. The years from 1898 to 1902 were years of grinding labour. Marie and Pierre worked together in the shed day after day, month after month, processing pitch blende, running tests, refining their procedures. The work was monotonous and exhausting, but they were driven by the knowledge that they were closing in on something extraordinary. Slowly, incrementally, they concentrated the radium. A sample that was 100 times more radioactive than uranium became 1,000 times more radioactive, then 10,000 times. The atomic weight measurements began to converge. Radium was real, they were certain of it, but they needed to isolate it in pure form to convince the skeptics. Finally, in 1902, after 4 years of labour, Marie succeeded. From several tons of pitchblende residue, she isolated 1/10 of a gram of radium chloride. It was a tiny amount, barely visible, but it was pure. She measured its atomic weight precisely, 225. She determined its place in the periodic table. She had proven beyond any doubt that radium was a new element. It was an almost superhuman achievement. She had processed tons of ore by hand, stirring, boiling, filtering, crystallizing. She had performed thousands of chemical operations with meticulous precision, and she had done it while raising a child, managing a household, and enduring the physical toll of working in a freezing, leaking shed with no proper equipment. In 1903, Marie Curie defended her doctoral thesis at the Sorbonne. Her thesis, Research on Radioactive Substances, summarized her work on uranium, thorium, polonium, and radium. The examining committee awarded her a doctorate with highest honours. She was the first woman in France to receive a doctorate in physics. The thesis made waves in the scientific community. Here was not just a competent piece of work, but a transformative one. Marie had discovered 2 new elements. She had coined the term radioactivity and shown it was an atomic property. She had demonstrated that atoms were not indivisible, that they had an internal structure and could spontaneously emit energy. She had opened up an entirely new field of physics. Recognition came quickly. In December 1903, the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences announced that the Nobel Prize in Physics would be awarded to Henri Becquerel, Pierre Curie and Marie Curie for their work on radioactivity. It was the first time a woman had ever been awarded a Nobel Prize in any category. There was a twist, though. Initially, the committee had planned to award the prize only to Becquerel and Pierre, omitting Marie entirely. It was Pierre who insisted that Marie's contributions were at least equal to his own, that she had been the driving force behind the research, that without her the discoveries would not have been made. The committee relented, and Marie's name was added. The Nobel Prize brought the Curie's sudden fame. Newspapers around the world ran stories about the husband and wife team who had discovered radium. Marie, as the first woman to win a Nobel, received particular attention. Reporters showed up at their apartment, wanting interviews and photographs. The Curies, who valued their privacy and their work above all else, found the attention intrusive and exhausting. But before we continue with the story of what came after the Nobel Prize, let us pause and consider the woman herself. Who was Marie Curie in her daily life? What was she like as a person, beyond her achievements? Those who knew Marie in these years when she was in her 30s, at the height of her powers, describe a woman of striking contrasts. Physically, she was small and slight, barely 5 feet 3 inches tall, weighing perhaps 100 pounds. Years of poverty and hard physical labour in the laboratory had left her thin, almost fragile looking, though she was stronger than she appeared. Her hands bore the scars of her work, burns and lesions from handling radioactive materials, fingers stained with chemicals that would not wash clean. Her face was memorable, not beautiful in the conventional sense, but arresting. She had a high, broad forehead, a sign of intelligence in the physiognomy of the era, and grey-blue eyes that were intensely observant. People who met Marie often commented on her eyes, how they seemed to look through you, assessing, analysing, missing nothing. When she was interested in a topic, her eyes would light up, becoming almost luminous. When bored or irritated, they became cold, distant, a wall shutting you out. Her hair was ash blonde, streaked with premature grey from stress and illness, though she was not yet 40. She wore it pulled back in a simple bun, refusing to waste time on elaborate hairstyles. Fashion held no interest for her. She owned perhaps 3 dresses, all dark, practical, chosen for durability rather than style. She wore the same dress day after day until it wore out, then replaced it with something identical. The idea of shopping for clothes, of caring about fashion, struck her as absurd, a waste of time that could be spent working. Indeed, Marie's relationship with domestic life was complex and telling. She was married, a mother of 2 daughters, and she did her best to fulfill those roles, but they were never her primary identity. She cooked because her family needed to eat, but she cooked the same simple meals repeatedly, refusing to waste time on elaborate recipes. Bread, soup, vegetables, occasionally fish or meat. That was the extent of her culinary repertoire. When Pierre was alive, he had sometimes gently suggested that she might vary the menu occasionally. She would look at him with genuine incomprehension. Why change something that worked? She cleaned the apartment with the same mechanical efficiency, doing what was necessary to maintain basic hygiene and order, nothing more. There were no decorative touches, no curtains or cushions, no pictures on the walls beyond a few photographs of family. The apartment was clean but stark, furnished with the bare minimum. Every object had a purpose. Beauty for its own sake held no appeal. Her daughters, Irene and Eve, grew up understanding that their mother loved them fiercely, but that her work came first, always. Marie would spend time with them in the evenings, teaching them, reading to them, checking their homework with the same meticulous attention she brought to her experiments. But her mind was often elsewhere, already planning the next day's work, thinking through experimental problems. Irene, the older daughter, understood this better than Eve. Irene was drawn to science from an early age, and she and Marie communicated most deeply through scientific discussions. Eve, who had become a musician and writer, sometimes felt like a puzzle to her mother, someone whose interests and abilities Marie respected but could not quite understand. How could anyone prefer music to mathematics? Marie's daily routine, when she was working on a major research project, was punishing. She would wake before dawn, often at 5 a.m, and lie in bed for a few minutes planning the day's work. Then she would rise, dress in her work clothes, which were permanently stained with chemical residues, and have a simple breakfast of bread and coffee. By 7, she would be in the laboratory. In the years when she worked in the shed with Pierre, this meant walking through the streets of Paris in the pre-dawn darkness, arriving before anyone else. She would light the lamps, check on experiments that had been running overnight, and begin the day's work. When Pierre was alive, he would arrive shortly after, and they would work together, often in companionable silence, each understanding what the other was doing without needing to explain. The work itself was often tedious and physically demanding. When she was isolating radium, she spent entire days stirring enormous vats of boiling liquid, a task that required constant attention and tremendous physical strength. The iron rod she used for stirring was nearly as tall as she was and almost too heavy to lift. But she would stir for hours, her arms aching, her back screaming in pain, never pausing, never complaining. She would work straight through until early afternoon, perhaps pausing to eat a piece of bread or an apple, then continue until 5 or 6 in the evening. Only then would she return home for dinner with her family. After dinner, she would spend an hour or two with her daughters, then retreat to her study to work on calculations or write up her results. She rarely went to bed before midnight, giving her perhaps 5 or 6 hours of sleep before beginning again. This schedule continued day after day, week after week, month after month. Pierre worried about her health, tried to convince her to rest more, to eat better, to take breaks. She would agree, promise to be more careful, then return to the laboratory the next day and work just as hard. What drove her? It was not ambition in the conventional sense. Marie was not seeking fame or glory. In fact, she actively avoided publicity, finding it irritating and distracting. Money did not motivate her. She and Pierre gave away the patent for radium isolation that could have made them wealthy. Recognition from other scientists pleased her, but it was not her goal. No, what drove Marie was something simpler and more profound. The pure intellectual joy of discovery, the satisfaction of solving a problem, the thrill of understanding something that had never been understood before. When she successfully isolated a fraction more radioactive than the one before, when she measured an atomic weight with greater precision, when she understood a phenomenon more clearly, she experienced something close to ecstasy. Pierre understood this about her, shared it. It was the foundation of their partnership. They were not just husband and wife, not just colleagues, but kindred spirits who had found in each other someone who understood what mattered, someone for whom the work was everything. Socially, Marie was reserved, almost cold to those who did not know her well. She had little tolerance for small talk, for social niceties, for the elaborate rituals of Parisian society. When forced to attend receptions or dinners, she would stand slightly apart, answering questions politely but briefly, waiting for an opportunity to leave. She made almost no effort to be charming or likable, and as a result many people found her difficult, arrogant even. But with the few people she cared about, Marie was different. With her daughters, with her sister Bronia, with a small circle of scientific colleagues who shared her passion for research, she could be warm, even playful. She had a dry sense of humour that emerged in private, often at unexpected moments. She could laugh at absurdity, including the absurdity of her own life. A poor Polish woman who had somehow ended up teaching at the Sorbonne and winning Nobel Prizes. With Pierre before his death, she had been most fully herself. They would work side by side for hours without speaking, communicating through glances and small gestures. Then suddenly one would think of something and they would talk for hours, interrupting each other, finishing each other's thoughts, arguing about interpretations, agreeing on next steps. It was a marriage of minds as much as hearts, and when Pierre died, Marie lost not just a husband, but the only person who truly understood her. Her relationship with Poland remained central to her identity throughout her life, even though she lived in France. She named the first element she discovered polonium after her lost homeland. She taught her daughters Polish, insisted they be proud of their heritage. When Poland finally regained independence after World War I, Marie wept with joy, the only time her daughters could remember seeing her cry except when Pierre died. She maintained correspondence with Polish scientists, supported Polish students studying in Paris, contributed money — she had very little money to give — to causes supporting Polish education and culture. France gave her the opportunity to become a scientist, but Poland remained her emotional homeland. Marie's personality was shaped by the hardships she'd endured. The years of poverty as a student, sleeping in an unheated garret, going hungry to save money for books, had taught her that she could survive on almost nothing, that physical comfort was dispensable. The years as a governess, watching Kazimierz Żurawski choose his family's money over her, had taught her that she could depend only on herself, that romantic love was unreliable. The death of her mother and sister when she was young, the loss of Pierre when she was still relatively young, these tragedies had taught her that nothing was permanent, that everyone you loved could be taken from you without warning. This knowledge made her fiercely protective of her daughters, but also emotionally guarded. She had been hurt too many times to risk opening herself fully to others. Yet there was also a stubbornness in Marie, an absolute refusal to accept defeat or limitation. When told women could not study at university, she found a way to study anyway. When told she could not access certain laboratories or equipment, she improvised, she made do, she found alternative methods. When her husband died and everyone expected her to collapse, to retire from science, to live quietly as a widow, she instead became a professor and kept working. This stubbornness sometimes manifested as inflexibility. Marie could be harsh in her judgments, unwilling to compromise on matters of principle, impatient with people who did not share her dedication. She had little sympathy for weakness or laziness. She had worked herself nearly to death, had sacrificed comfort and health, and sometimes her relationship with her daughters for her research. She expected others to show similar dedication, but this same inflexibility made her incorruptible. She could not be bought, could not be flattered into compromising her scientific integrity, could not be intimidated into silence. When she reported results, they could be trusted absolutely. When she trained students, she demanded the higher standards. The work had to be perfect, or it was worthless. In her 50s and 60s, as radiation poisoning began to take its toll, Marie's daily routine became more difficult. Her hands shook, making delicate experimental work challenging. Her eyes, damaged by cataracts, struggled with the fine print of scientific papers. She tired more easily, needed to rest more often. But she adjusted, delegating more to assistants, focusing on planning and analysis rather than hands-on laboratory work, refusing to stop entirely. Her appearance changed as well. The years of radiation exposure had aged her prematurely. By her 60s she looked a decade older, her face deeply lined, her hands gnarled and scarred. But her eyes remained sharp, that penetrating gaze that missed nothing, and her mind remained brilliant. Those who worked with Marie in her later years often described the same scene. Marie at her desk in the Radium Institute, bent over a paper or a notebook, making calculations or checking someone's results, utterly absorbed. She would work until she simply could not work anymore, until exhaustion forced her to stop. And the next day, she would begin again. This was Marie Curie, not as a symbol or an icon, but as a human being, a woman of tremendous brilliance and equally tremendous stubbornness, capable of extraordinary kindness and equally extraordinary coldness, driven by a passion for knowledge so consuming that nothing else, not poverty, not prejudice, not illness, not even death, could stand in its way for long. Now, with this understanding of who Marie was, we can return to the story of her life after the Nobel Prize, understanding better both her triumphs and her tragedies. But the prize also brought money, 70,000 francs, a fortune for the chronically impoverished Curies. For the first time in their lives they had financial security. Pierre was able to negotiate a better position at the Sorbonne, one that came with a laboratory and some assistants. Marie was hired as his chief assistant. They could finally leave the shed, and radium, the substance they had worked so hard to isolate, was becoming famous in its own right. Scientists around the world wanted samples to study. Doctors began experimenting with radium as a treatment for cancer, finding that radiation could destroy tumours. Radium's eerie glow captured the public imagination, and it began to appear in consumer products, watch dials, cosmetics, even beverages marketed as health tonics. The Curies could have patented the process for isolating radium and become wealthy, but they refused. They believed that scientific knowledge should be freely available, that patents would hinder research. They published their methods in detail and freely shared samples with any scientist who requested them. It was a principled decision, but it also meant they would never profit from the radium boom. While others made fortunes manufacturing and selling radium, the Curies remained relatively poor, living on their modest academic salaries. But wealth had never been their goal. They wanted only to work, to discover, to push forward the boundaries of knowledge, and for a few more years they would have that chance. In December 1904, Marie gave birth to her second daughter, Eve. Unlike Irene, who would follow her parents into science and win her own Nobel Prize, Eve would become a writer and pianist, eventually writing a beautiful biography of her mother. The years after the Nobel Prize should have been triumphant. The Curies were famous, their work was recognised, they had resources they had never had before, but shadows were gathering. Both Marie and Pierre were chronically ill. They were constantly tired, plagued by mysterious pains, burns on their hands that would not heal. They attributed this to overwork, to the stress of their research. They did not understand that they were suffering from radiation poisoning, that years of exposure to radioactive materials were destroying their bodies at the cellular level. Pierre was particularly affected. He suffered from terrible bone pain, especially in his legs. Some days he could barely walk. His hands shook and he had difficulty sleeping. He aged rapidly, looking decades older than his years, but they kept working. In the spring of 1906, Pierre was offered a professorship at the Sorbonne, a position of genuine prestige. He accepted, grateful for the salary and the laboratory space that came with it. The future looked, if not bright, then at least stable, and then, on April 19th, 1906, Pierre Curie was killed. He had been walking in the rain near the Pont Neuf, distracted, tired, not paying attention. He stepped off the curb into the path of a horse-drawn wagon. The driver tried to stop, but the horses were spooked, and the wagon was heavy. Pierre fell, and the rear wheel of the wagon passed over his head, crushing his skull instantly. He died in the street, in the rain, at the age of 46. Marie received the news at home. She'd been working in the laboratory, and someone came to tell her there had been an accident. At first, she did not understand. Then, as the reality sank in, she did not scream or cry. She simply went silent, retreating into a frozen numbness. She wrote later that she felt as though her life had ended with Pierre's. She was 38 years old, the mother of 2 young daughters, a famous scientist, and she felt hollow, emptied of purpose and hope. Pierre had been her partner in everything, her intellectual equal, the only person who truly understood her. Without him, she did not know how to continue. The funeral was small. Marie refused all official ceremonies, all speeches and tributes. Pierre was buried in Sceaux, next to his mother, in a plain grave. May I place some flowers from the garden on the coffin, and then left. She did not cry at this funeral. She did not cry at all, not for months. But in the privacy of her home, she began a diary addressed to Pierre. In it she poured out her grief, her rage, her despair. She wrote to him as though he could still hear her, describing her days, her loneliness, her struggle to continue without him. The diary is almost unbearably painful to read, the raw cry of a person trying to make sense of unbearable loss. The Sorbonne offered Marie Pierre's professorship. It was an extraordinary gesture. Women did not hold professorships at the Sorbonne, had never held them in the 7 centuries of the university's existence. But the university wanted to honour Pierre's memory, and they recognised that Marie was more than capable of continuing his work. Marie accepted, not because she wanted the position, but because she could not bear the thought of Pierre's work ending, his laboratory closed, his students scattered. She would take his place. She would continue their research. It was the only way she could imagine honouring his memory. On November 5th, 1906, Marie Curie gave her first lecture as a professor at the Sorbonne. The lecture hall was packed, filled with students, faculty, journalists, and the merely curious, all wanting to witness history. No woman had ever stood at that lectern before. Marie entered the hall wearing black mourning clothes. She walked to the lectern without looking at the audience. When she spoke, her voice was quiet but steady. She began her lecture with the exact sentence where Pierre had left off in his last lecture, as though there had been no interruption, as though he was still alive and she was simply continuing the conversation. It was a devastating and brilliant gesture, an assertion that the work would continue, that death could not stop the pursuit of knowledge. The audience sat in stunned silence as Marie lectured on physics, on radioactivity, on the properties of radium. She was a professor now, the first woman to hold such a position in France. But the achievement brought her no joy. She was simply doing what she had to do, placing one foot in front of the other, surviving. And then, a few years later, came a scandal that nearly destroyed her. Marie's scientific work after Pierre's death was magnificent. She continued researching radium, successfully isolated pure radium metal for the first time, and made significant advances in understanding radioactive decay. In 1910, she published a comprehensive treatise on radioactivity that became the standard reference work in the field. In recognition of this work, she was awarded the Nobel Prize in Chemistry in 1911, becoming the first person ever to win 2 Nobel Prizes in different sciences. It should have been a moment of triumph. Instead, it became the worst period of her life. In 1910, Marie had begun a relationship with Paul Langevin, a physicist who had been Pierre's student and friend. Langevin was married but separated from his wife, living apart due to an abusive and unhappy marriage. He and Marie, both lonely and grieving, Pierre's death had devastated Langevin as well, grew close. The relationship became romantic. Langevin's wife, suspecting the affair, hired people to break into Langevin's apartment and steal his correspondence with Marie. She then leaked the letters to the press. The scandal exploded. French newspapers published the letters, accusing Marie of being a homewrecker, a foreign woman corrupting a French husband and father. The fact that Marie was Polish, an immigrant, was emphasized repeatedly. She was called a Jew, though she was not Jewish, the accusation itself revealing the anti-Semitism of the era. She was denounced from pulpits, threatened in anonymous letters. Mobs gathered outside her home, throwing stones at her windows. The attacks were vicious and sustained. The same newspapers that had celebrated Marie when she won her first Nobel Prize now tore her apart. Some suggested she should be deported. Others demanded she resign her professorship. The fact that she was a woman made the scandal far worse than it would have been for a man. Male scientists routinely had affairs and no one cared. But a woman, especially a woman who dared to work in a male profession, was held to a completely different standard. Marie, who had endured poverty, prejudice, Pierre's death, and radiation poisoning without breaking, nearly broke under the assault. She became ill, suffering from a kidney infection that was likely exacerbated by stress and radiation exposure. She was hospitalized, seriously ill for months. Even the Nobel Prize Committee wavered. Some members suggested that Marie should decline the chemistry prize to avoid further scandal, but other scientists, including Albert Einstein, rallied to her defense. Einstein wrote to Marie, telling her to ignore the gossip, to attend the ceremony, to accept the prize she had so clearly earned. Marie took his advice. In December 1911, weak and still recovering from her illness, she travelled to Stockholm and accepted the Nobel Prize in Chemistry. She delivered her lecture with dignity and grace, speaking about her research on radium and polonium, making no reference to the scandal. She was the only person to have won Nobel Prizes in 2 different sciences. It was a distinction she would hold alone for more than 50 years. But the triumph was hollow. She was exhausted, ill and alone. In the years that followed, Marie gradually rebuilt her life and reputation. The scandal faded. Her relationship with Langevin ended. She focused on her work, her daughters, and the construction of a new laboratory building, the Radium Institute, which was being built for her research. And then, in 1914, just as the Radium Institute was completed, World War I began. When war broke out, Marie was 56 years old. She could have evacuated Paris, taken her daughters to safety, sat out the war in some quiet corner of France. Instead, she decided to contribute to the war effort in the most direct way she could imagine, by bringing X-ray technology to the battlefield. X-rays, discovered by Wilhelm Röntgen in 1895, could reveal bullets and shrapnel embedded in bodies, broken bones, damaged organs. They were invaluable for surgeons treating wounded soldiers. But in 1914, X-ray equipment was bulky and existed only in major hospitals. Wounded soldiers had to be transported, often over terrible roads, to reach an X-ray machine. Many died on the journey. Marie had an idea. What if X-ray equipment could be made portable, mounted in vehicles that could be driven directly to field hospitals near the front lines? She could bring the X-rays to the soldiers instead of bringing the soldiers to the X-rays. She threw herself into the project with characteristic intensity. She raised money, begged for donations of equipment, learned to drive so she could operate the vehicles herself. She requisitioned vehicles from anyone who would donate them and converted them into mobile X-ray units. The soldiers called them petite Curies, little Curies. Marie drove these vehicles to the front, often under fire, and set up X-ray equipment in field hospitals. She taught doctors and nurses how to use the equipment, how to position patients, how to develop the photographic plates. She worked 18-hour days in freezing, unsanitary conditions, breathing the diesel fumes of the vehicles and the chemical fumes of the dark rooms. Her daughter Irene, just 17 years old, joined her. Together, mother and daughter brought X-ray technology to the battlefield, saving thousands of lives by helping surgeons locate and remove bullets and shrapnel more quickly and accurately. By the end of the war, Marie had equipped 20 mobile radiological units and 200 fixed X-ray stations. She had trained 150 X-ray technicians. She had personally driven to the front countless times, performing X-rays on wounded soldiers even as battles raged nearby. She received no payment for this work, no official recognition during the war itself. She simply did it because it needed to be done, because she had the knowledge and skills to make a difference, and because she could not bear to sit idle while people suffered. After the war ended in 1918, Marie returned to the Radium Institute and her research. She was 61 years old, exhausted, and increasingly ill. The years of radiation exposure were taking their toll. She suffered from cataracts, her vision growing progressively worse. Her hands were scarred and damaged from handling radioactive materials. She had chronic anemia, frequent fevers, persistent fatigue. But she kept working. She trained students, supervised research, wrote papers, gave lectures. The Radium Institute became a world centre for radioactivity research, attracting scientists from around the globe. Marie presided over it with the same meticulous attention to detail she brought to her experiments. In 1921, Marie made a trip to the United States, invited by an American woman named Marie Mattingly Melanie, who had organised a fundraising campaign to buy Marie 1 gram of radium for her research. Radium was now expensive, too expensive for Marie to purchase on her own, and she needed it to continue her work. The trip was a triumph. Marie was greeted as a hero, a pioneering woman scientist who had overcome immense obstacles. She met President Warren G. Harding, who presented her with a gram of radium in a small lead-lined container. She toured universities, gave lectures, and inspired a generation of young American women to pursue science. But the trip also exhausted her. The constant travel, the public appearances, the relentless attention, all drained her dwindling energy. She returned to France in worse health than when she left. Over the next decade, Marie continued to work, but her body was failing. The cataracts in her eyes grew worse, and she underwent several painful eye surgeries. Her hearing declined. She suffered from dizzy spells and had difficulty walking. Her hands shook, making laboratory work increasingly difficult. She knew she was dying, though she may not have understood exactly what was killing her. The concept of radiation poisoning was not well understood even by the 1920s. Marie had spent decades handling radioactive materials with no protection, breathing radioactive dust, working in contaminated environments. Her body had absorbed enormous doses of radiation, enough to cause catastrophic cellular damage. In the spring of 1934, Marie travelled to a sanatorium in San Selemos in the French Alps, hoping the mountain air would help her recover from what she believed was tuberculosis or pneumonia. But her condition only worsened. She ran fevers, grew weaker, could barely eat. On July 4th, 1934, at 9:30 in the morning, Marie Curie died. She was 66 years old. The death certificate listed the cause as aplastic, anemia, a condition where the bone marrow stops producing blood cells. But the true cause was radiation poisoning. Decades of exposure that had destroyed her bone marrow and her immune system. Irene and Eve were with her at the end. Marie's last recorded words were asking for her laboratory notebooks, wanting to review some data even as she lay dying. Her final thoughts were of the work, always the work. The funeral was held on July 6, 1934 in Sceaux, where Pierre was buried. Marie was laid to rest beside him in the same simple grave. The ceremony was small and private, just family and a few close colleagues. There were no official state honours, no grand speeches. Marie, who had lived a life of relentless work and minimal ceremony, was buried the same way. But the story does not end there. In 1995, 61 years after her death, Marie and Pierre Curie were moved to the Panthéon in Paris, France's great national mausoleum, where the country's most honoured citizens are buried. Marie became the first woman to be interred there on her own merits, not merely as the wife of a great man. The ceremony was grand and solemn. Their coffins, which had to be lead-lined because they remained radioactive, were carried through the streets of Paris and placed in the Panthéon's crypt, alongside Victor Hugo, Voltaire, Rousseau, and other giants of French culture. Marie Curie's laboratory notebooks are still stored at the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris, but they must be kept in lead-lined boxes. They remain so radioactive that researchers who wish to consult them must sign a liability waiver and wear protective equipment. The pages glow faintly even now, more than a century after Marie wrote on them. What is the legacy of Marie Curie? It is vast and multifaceted, touching science, medicine, and society itself. Her scientific contributions were transformative. She discovered two new elements, polonium and radium. She coined the term radioactivity and proved it was an atomic property, fundamentally changing our understanding of matter. She showed that atoms were not indivisible, but had internal structure, paving the way for quantum physics and nuclear energy. Her daughter Irene would continue this work, discovering artificial radioactivity and winning her own Nobel Prize in chemistry in 1935. Her medical legacy is equally profound. Radium and other radioactive materials became crucial tools in cancer treatment. Radiation therapy, one of the main treatments for cancer today, descends directly from Marie's work. The mobile X-ray units she developed during World War I saved countless lives and established the importance of medical imaging in emergency care. But perhaps her greatest legacy is symbolic. Marie Curie proved that women could do science at the highest level, that genius had no gender. She did this not by asking for permission or waiting for society to change, but by simply doing the work, producing results so undeniable that even the most prejudiced had to acknowledge them. She faced obstacles that would have stopped almost anyone else. She grew up in an occupied country where she could not attend university. She was poor, so poor she nearly starved as a student. She was a woman in a profession that barely tolerated women. She was an immigrant in a country that viewed foreigners with suspicion. She worked in a freezing shed with primitive equipment, and she won 2 Nobel Prizes, discovered 2 elements, founded an entirely new scientific discipline, saved thousands of lives in wartime, and trained a generation of scientists who carried on her work. She did this while raising 2 daughters, largely alone after Pierre's death. She did this while enduring a vicious public scandal that would have broken many people. She did this while her body was slowly being destroyed by the very radiation she had discovered. Marie Curie's life was not easy or comfortable. She sacrificed much, her health, her privacy, years of crushing poverty and exhausting work. But she never sacrificed her integrity, her commitment to science, or her belief that knowledge should be freely shared for the benefit of humanity. In the Pantheon in Paris, her tomb bears a simple inscription, Marie Curie, 1867 to 1934. No titles, no honours listed, just her name and the years of her life. It is fitting, perhaps, for a woman who cared nothing for honours and everything for the work. But the work speaks for itself. Every person who survives cancer treatment with radiation therapy owes something to Marie Curie. Every physics student who studies atomic structure is building on her discoveries. Every woman who pursues a career in science walks a path she helped clear. She once wrote, "Nothing in life is to be feared. It is only to be understood. Now is the time to understand more, so that we may fear less." Marie Curie spent her life pursuing understanding, pushing back the boundaries of fear and ignorance, shining light into the unknown. The light she kindled still burns in the laboratories where scientists continue her work, in the hospitals where radiation saves lives, and in the hearts of everyone who believes that knowledge, freely pursued and freely shared, can make the world better. She was born Maria Sklodowska in occupied Warsaw, a girl with no prospects and no future. She died Marie Curie, buried in the Pantheon among France's immortals, a woman whose work changed the world. The impossible became possible because she refused to accept impossibility. The barriers fell because she simply walked through them as though they were not there. And the radioactive glow that killed her also illuminated secrets of the universe that humanity had never known before. She worked until the very end, asking for her notebooks even on her deathbed. The work was everything, the only thing that mattered. And the work continues, as it will continue as long as there are people willing to ask questions, willing to endure hardship, willing to give everything in pursuit of truth. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the life of one of history's most remarkable figures. If you enjoyed this story, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe. I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. What aspect of Marie Curie's life inspired you most? Until our next journey into the past, I wish you a calm and peaceful night. May you rest well, and may the stories of those who came before us continue to illuminate our own paths forward. Good night.